On December 28, 1964, 16-year-old Beverly Jarosz and her younger sister Carol walked to their grandmother's house in Garfield Heights, Ohio, to visit and have lunch. When lunch was over, Beverly returned to her home to meet up with some friends. In the few fleeting minutes between returning home and meeting her friends, she would be murdered in her own bedroom. 56 years later, her killer is still out there. From the South Shore of Lake Erie, this is Great Lakes True Crime. While today Garfield Heights is a working-class, inner-ring suburb southeast of Cleveland, Ohio, with an 8-lane interstate running through it, in 1964 it was a quiet, upper-middle-class community. It would have been considered an all-American city, and Beverly Jarosz was the quintessential all-American schoolgirl. She lived in a tidy suburb with her parents and one sister. Her mother, Eleanor, worked full-time in an office, and her father, Thaddeus, who went by Ted, was co-owner of a small manufacturing company. Her younger sister Carol took horseback riding lessons, and Beverly was an attractive girl with light brown hair and blue eyes. She was very popular, an 11th grade student at Marymount High School, which was an all-girls Catholic school in Garfield Heights that's now co-ed and known as Trinity High School. Beverly enjoyed listening to jazz and classical music. She loved literature and was a frequent visitor to the world-renowned Cleveland Museum of Art. She volunteered at the local hospital and aspired to become a teacher after college. Beverly was described by friends as fairly quiet and even a touch moody and secretive, but she was also a very loyal friend once she trusted someone. She wrote poetry that was characteristic of a somewhat angsty teenager. She had a straight-laced, clean-cut boyfriend and no known enemies. For Christmas that year, her parents gave Beverly a complete Shakespeare volume and a leather gold-embossed blank journal to write her poetry in. She started using the journal immediately. The Jarosz family lived in a typical post-World War II bungalow on Thornton Avenue in Garfield Heights. The 1,500-square-foot house, which still stands today and has changed very little over the years, has 2 bedrooms on the first floor, while the entire second floor serves as one large bedroom that Beverly and Carol shared. These post-war bungalows are considered 1.5-story homes, as the second floor is essentially the attic. There are thousands of these nearly identical houses all over suburban Cleveland. The murder, which is understandably still difficult to discuss for those close to Beverly, shocked the entire Cleveland area. It made the front page of Cleveland's 2 major newspapers for months, as it was a murder that happened in the middle of the day in Beverly's bedroom on a quiet residential street and in what seemed like a very safe community. The feeling was that if it happened then and there, it could happen anywhere and to anyone. But this doesn't seem like a random crime. The timing must have been meticulously calculated. It's even been described as an assassination. The attack happened on December 28, 1964, the day after the Cleveland Browns' last NFL championship, on the quiet Monday right after Christmas. Beverly and her sister Carol were home from school on Christmas break. They ate breakfast with their parents, heading off to work. The 2 girls stayed home for a while that morning before walking together a mile up Turney Road, which was a nearby major road through Garfield Heights, to visit their grandmother, Marie Vanek, and they stayed there for lunch. Beverly was wearing dark pants, a white blouse, and a black cardigan. They got to their grandma's house around 10:30 a.m., and while there, Beverly did her grandma's hair, and their great-grandma was there too. Everyone kind of joked around and had a great time. Around noon, Carol stayed at the grandma's house after lunch while Beverly started walking home. Beverly's friend and classmate Barbara was expected to arrive at 1:30, and the pair were going to walk together to the house of another classmate named Margie. A neighbor of their grandma saw Beverly walking and told her 18-year-old son to drive her home since it was a cold day out. The young man drove Beverly home, saw nothing unusual when he dropped her off, and then returned home. He would later be cleared of the murder, and it's difficult to imagine the inner turmoil that he must have felt after knowing he dropped her off just minutes before her murder. So Beverly was dropped off at her home around 12:10 p.m. that day. She hung her coat on the banister, set her purse and a book on the dinette table, and turned on the radio. We know the radio was on because it was heard in the background when she was talking on the phone shortly after. At some point, between 12:10 and 12:40 that day, Beverly answered a phone call. The caller asked if her dad was home. After letting the caller know that he wasn't home, Beverly wrote down a message that said, "Steven Stankiewicz called, we'll call back later." But Steven didn't call back later, and it turned out that no one in the house knew anyone by that name. At 12:40 p.m., half an hour after she was dropped off at home, Beverly answered another phone call, this one from a local jeweler who advised that her mother's necklace repair was finished. About 20 minutes later, at 1 o'clock, Beverly called her mom at work to let her know about the necklace. They stayed on the line and talked for a few moments before Beverly got off the phone so she could change her clothes. At 1:10 p.m., Beverly's grandma, Marie Vanek, called, and the two chatted for a couple minutes. Beverly sounded rushed, and then she said that, "I can't talk to you now, Grandma. Barbara's here," and she hung up the phone. It seems that in the next 5 minutes, Beverly Jarosz was murdered in her bedroom. It wasn't Barbara at the door, after all, but there wasn't a struggle when Beverly answered the door. Between 1:10 and 1:15, Beverly must have went upstairs to change her clothes after she let the killer in the door. Again, there was no sign of a struggle downstairs, and the murder happened in the upstairs bedroom. About 1:20 or 1:25 p.m., Beverly's friend Barbara was dropped off by her mom at Beverly's house. They saw no cars in the driveway or parked on the street in front of the house. Barbara went to the side door, which is common with this type of house. There's typically a side door along the narrow driveways that people tend to use for access at these bungalows. The inner door was wide open, but the outer storm door was locked. The radio was now playing very loudly. With no answer at the side door, Barbara went to the front door and rang the doorbell. She was getting a little bit annoyed, but also a touch worried at this point. While waiting for Barbara to answer the door, Beverly took a magazine from the mailbox and began thumbing through it. While looking through the magazine, she heard a loud thump from inside the house. She later said it sounded like someone knocking over a dresser upstairs. After about 15 minutes, she went home but called Beverly's house a few times with no answer. She also called their friend Margie, whose house they were planning on going to, but of course Margie hadn't heard from Beverly either. By 4 p.m. that day, the two friends of Beverly were getting really worried, so they called Grandma Marie Vanek's house, who then called Ted at work. Ted, her father, rushed home, arriving around 4:30, and found that the inner side door was still open, but now the storm door was unlocked. The back door was open as well, and the family had never used that door. So let's take a quick break, and we'll get into what Ted found at the house right after this. When Ted got home, the front door was locked, and there was no sign of forced entry at any of the doors, nor was anything missing from the house. The radio was still on really loud, playing classical music. In a panic, Ted ran upstairs, where he found Beverly's lifeless body. He then went downstairs to call the police, taking care not to touch anything, since the house was obviously a crime scene. The scene was so shocking, in fact, that the Garfield Heights police, within 5 minutes, called the much larger Cleveland Police Department for help. This is understandable, as there was a lot going on at the scene. Here's what investigators found. Beverly was found face down on the floor in between the twin beds. The primary cause of death was strangulation by rope, but the coroner stated that she would have also died from her stab wounds. She had been stabbed 42 times, mostly in the neck, chest, and shoulders, with a very sharp object, approximately 3 to 5 inches long. She had not been sexually assaulted, but her sweater was pulled down to her hips, and she was nude from the waist down. 3 lengths of rope were found in the bedroom. 2 of the pieces had loops tied at either end. The rope was found to have actually been from a clothesline, and not a new rope, but a used clothesline. No knife was recovered at the scene. It's been speculated that the murder weapon may not have been a knife at all, but actually Beverly's letter opener that she kept near her bed. And 12 fingerprints and a few bloody palm prints were found, and all but 3 belonged to either Beverly or another family member. A police dog was used in the crime scene investigation. The dog followed a scent from the bedroom out the back door and across a few yards to the next street north, which was called McCracken. But that was as far as the scent was tracked. A neighbor said he saw a man in his 20s walking casually down the Jarosz driveway around 1:45 that day. The man got into a car parked between 2 other cars and drove away. As you'll recall, though, her friend Barbara didn't notice any cars in front of the house, so it's never been established which eyewitness was correct, if either. The police interviewed over 300 people. Many of Beverly's male friends came in voluntarily for questioning, and they were all fingerprinted and polygraphed. None of them were considered to be suspects. A delivery driver saw a young man walking down the street right around the time of the murder, but he and his parents came forward and he was cleared of any wrongdoing. The police fielded many leads like this, but none of them seemed to really lead anywhere. Aside from the tips that police were receiving, Beverly's mother, Eleanor, and her younger sister, Carol, believed that Beverly had a stalker. There were hang-up calls, sometimes as many as a dozen a day before the murder, and the calls ended a couple weeks before the murder. About 5 months earlier, in July, Beverly received an anonymous gift of a sterling silver bracelet and ring in the mailbox. The box was from a major department store in the area. Beverly was freaked out by these gifts and never wore either of them. The following month, in August, an inexpensive brooch and bracelet were found on the back porch, also addressed to Beverly. One night, Ted Jarosz caught someone on the front lawn staring up at the girl's bedroom. Ted chased him down the street, but didn't catch him. Beverly was freaked out by all this and became pretty jumpy. She always locked the doors and closed the blinds when she was home. She even locked her parents out of the house one day. She made sure to check in by phone whenever she went anywhere. In fact, the letter opener that may have been the murder weapon was an item Beverly bought specifically to keep in her bedroom for protection. Detectives concluded that Beverly must have known her killer. With being as security conscious as she was, she wouldn't have left the door unlocked or let someone in the house that she didn't know. The police investigation was extremely thorough. Garfield Heights police interviewed every boy Beverly had dated or spent time with, the young man who gave her a ride home, and a boy who bagged groceries at the local store, and of course her boyfriend Roger. They also looked at her ex-boyfriend Dan, who was a little more of a bad boy than Roger. He might have even been considered a greaser back then. Both of the boyfriends had alibis, but neither was ironclad. They both passed polygraph tests and seemed to have been ruled out. The investigation continued and rewards were offered, including a $10,000 reward offered by the Cleveland Press newspaper, which is now defunct. This was an extraordinary amount of money at the time, much more than even the average annual household income at the time. And because of that, there were lots of tips submitted to police, but there was never a significant amount of evidence to pin against any one individual. The family stayed with Eleanor's parents in the day after the murder, as investigators and newspaper and TV photographers and reporters trooped through their house. Relatives scoured the blood from the floor before the family returned. A parish priest blessed the house, room by room, affixing a medal that still remains above an entry door today. Carol said that the family never discussed the murder, never even mentioned Beverly's name again, but the awareness was always there, just under the surface. Carol eventually returned to her old bedroom, sleeping in her bed right next to where her sister was murdered. In high school, Carol considered becoming a Catholic nun, even entering the Marymount Convent and living there for 2 years. She didn't go through with the vocation and eventually got married and had kids of her own. Today, she's a grandmother with 4 grown children and shares very little of her story publicly. Ted and Eleanor eventually got divorced, with Ted staying in the house for another 30-plus years. He left everything as it had been in 1964, hoping that a jury someday might need to visit. And there were more victims in this case than just Beverly. We all know how the internet can be, and many armchair detectives, and just trolls in general, subjected Ted to slurs, innuendos, and even threats in some cases. Beverly's friend Barbara was harassed and became the victim of bullies. The young man who drove Beverly home that one fateful day was also harassed and subject to lots of accusations. And something else happened later, victimizing the family once again. 7 years after Barbara's murder, while Ted and Eleanor were at a neighbor's funeral, the Jarosz household was broken into. Nothing was stolen from the house, except for a gold watch. But the backing had been ripped off of 2 prints hanging on the wall. They were reproductions of 2 18th century portraits that were favorites of Beverly, and they had been framed for her by Ted. It was the type of break-in that wasn't so much a random burglary, but more like someone was looking for something specific. Beverly Jarosz was murdered in her own home on December 28, 1964, almost 56 years to the day this episode is being released. It's very possible that her killer is still out there, hiding his secret all these years. If you know anything about the Beverly Jarosz murder, anything at all, it's time to finally speak up, do the right thing, call the Garfield Heights Police Department at area code 216-475-1234. Now for today's streaming recommendation. I'm going back a few years to the series called Brawn or Brawn, spelled B-R-O-N or B-R-O-E-N, which translates to the bridge in English. The series is subtitled and was active from 2011 to 2018. The premise is that a body is found on a bridge connecting Denmark and Sweden, directly on the border, so a Danish inspector and a Swedish detective named Saga Noren have to share jurisdiction and work together to find the killer. The 2 countries, 2 languages is why the series is spelled 2 different ways. Anyways, Sega can be described as a no-nonsense detective with Asperger's syndrome. While I'm not overly familiar with Asperger's, many reviews of the character indicate that the actor did an excellent job with it, and I can agree that her character is riveting. I'm not sure which platforms it's on right now, as it's difficult to keep up with all these different streaming platforms that are out there, but the show is available through my local library's digital media offerings right now, so you might want to start there. In any case, if you're interested in Nordic noir and don't mind subtitles, I recommend that you check it out. It's called The Bridge. You've been listening to Great Lakes True Crime. To follow us on social media, please search for Great Lakes True Crime on Facebook or Twitter. You can also email the show with case suggestions. Send your email to greatlakestruecrime@gmail.com. If you like the show, please leave us a 5-star review on your podcast app. It's a huge help. This has been your host, Steve, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening, Buys.